I was sitting in the back of a probate courtroom in Charleston, South Carolina, watching my uncle explain to a judge why I should no longer be trusted to manage my own affairs. He used words like erratic and emotionally compromised, but the kind of practiced calm that only comes from years of speaking in boardrooms while people quietly nodded. Behind him, my father was dabbing at his eyes with a folded handkerchief, performing grief so convincingly I almost forgot he had rehearsed it at the kitchen table the week before. My mother sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for church to begin. I didn't say anything. I didn't turn to my attorney and whisper objections. I rested my fingers on the slim leather portfolio in my lap, felt the cool metal edge of the pen click to the front pocket, and I thought about what my grandfather had told me the last time I sat in his study. "Eleanor," he had said, "the people who love you loudest are usually the ones watching your pockets." I had laughed then. I wasn't laughing now. But I wasn't afraid either. Before I tell you exactly how my uncle unraveled everything he had spent 3 months building, in the span of about 11 minutes, I want you to drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I want to know who's out there, because this story is for anyone who has ever been made to feel small by the people who were supposed to make you feel safe. To understand why I sat silent in that courtroom while 3 people who shared my blood tried to paint me as unstable, you need to go back to the morning of my grandfather's will reading. That was the day everything I thought I understood about my family cracked straight down the middle and showed me what was underneath. My grandfather built Whitmore Restoration Group from nothing. He had started it in the late 70s with one historic property on the edge of the French Quarter district in Charleston, a crumbling Victorian that everyone else had written off. He saw what it could be, and he spent 40 years turning that vision into a company that owned and restored historic properties across the Southeast. He had an eye for beauty in things that looked broken. That was the quality I inherited from him. My uncle inherited his ambition without the patience. We were gathered in the conference room of my grandfather's attorney on a gray Tuesday in March. My uncle arrived in a suit that cost more than my monthly rent. My father at his elbow, the way he always was, slightly behind, slightly deferential, orbiting his older brother the way he had done their entire lives. My mother sat next to my father. I sat across from them, next to my cousin Diane, the only person in that room I trusted even slightly. The attorney read for 20 minutes before anyone's expression changed. When he reached the distribution of assets, I watched my uncle's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. My grandfather left the majority ownership of Whitmore Restoration Group, the flagship property on Lawrence Street, and the personal art collection he had spent 60 years assembling, entirely to me, not to my uncle who had worked alongside him for 12 years. Not to my father, who had managed the accounting division for a decade. To me. Eleanor Whitmore, 29 years old, who spent her days doing contract work as a historic preservation consultant and lived in a rented apartment with a temperamental radiator and too many houseplants. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then my uncle smiled, and it was the kind of smile that doesn't reach anything above the cheekbones. The explosion didn't come that day. It came slowly, like water working its way under a foundation. In the weeks after the reading, I began receiving calls from my father. Gentle calls at first, checking in, asking how I was handling everything. Then less gentle. My uncle, he explained, had significant financial obligations tied to a development project that had stalled. There were investors involved. There were deadlines. If I would simply agree to sell the Warren Street property and liquidate a portion of the portfolio, the family could resolve everything and move forward. I said no. My father asked again differently, using the language of family loyalty and shared responsibility. I said no again. Then my uncle called me directly. I sat at my kitchen table and listened to him explain, with perfect composure, that my grandfather had clearly not been in a sound state of mind in the final months of his life. That I had been, his word, influencing him. That a man of my grandfather's standing would never have passed over his business partners, his sons, in favor of a young woman with no corporate experience. He said it the way someone states an obvious fact. They've grown tired of repeating. I told him that I wasn't selling anything, and I ended the call. I knew then that there would be a next move. I just didn't know yet how far they were willing to go. I found out on a Wednesday morning in April, when I arrived at the Lawrence Street property for a scheduled walkthrough with a contractor. The caretaker met me at the gate with an expression I had never seen on him before. Something caught between apology and dread. The main office had been accessed overnight. The filing cabinets had been pulled open, folders scattered across the floor. A framed architectural rendering my grandfather had commissioned in 1987, one of the pieces he was proudest of, had been pulled from the wall and left face down on the carpet, the glass cracked through. On the antique writing desk in the corner, someone had left a bottle of prescription medication. The label had my name on it. A prescription I had never filled, for a medication I had never been prescribed. for a condition I did not have. I stood in the doorway and made myself breathe. I heard footsteps on the hardwood behind me and turned to find my uncle coming through the side entrance, my father just behind him. My uncle was wearing a blazer over a collared shirt. He looked at the room, then looked at me, with an expression of elaborate practice concern. "We've been trying to reach you," he said quietly. "Your father and I were worried. The caretaker called us when he couldn't get you on the phone." He gestured toward the prescription bottle on the desk. "Eleanor, we know you've been under enormous pressure since the reading. We're not here to judge you. We just want to get you some help." I looked at the bottle. I looked at the cracked frame on the floor. I looked at my uncle's face, which was arranged into perfect, compassionate concern, and I felt something drop through me, cold and clear. This was not a conversation. This was a scene. He had written it, staged it, and invited me to play my assigned role, the unstable heir who had finally cracked under the weight of something she never deserved to have. If I raised my voice, I was the woman losing control. If I cried, I was the woman falling apart. If I pointed at the medication bottle and said, "You put that there," I was the woman making paranoid accusations against her own family. He was very good. I had to give him that. I smoothed my jacket. I took one slow breath. And then I did the only thing he wasn't expecting. I said, "You're right. I appreciate you checking on me." I watched something flicker across his face. Not relief, something more careful than that. "I think I do need some support right now," I continued. "I'm going to call my doctor today." My uncle nodded, and my father exhaled, and they left 40 minutes later after a conversation in which I agreed to nothing specific and gave away nothing at all. I stood at the window and watched their car pull out of the drive, and then I called my attorney from the parking lot of a coffee shop 3 blocks away and told her everything. Her name is Renata. She had been my grandfather's personal attorney for 16 years, and she had, I learned during that phone call, already anticipated something like this. She told me to document everything. She told me to say nothing to my family beyond pleasantries. And then she said something I wrote down on a napkin and kept in my coat pocket for the next 6 weeks. "They're going to try to make you react. Don't give them the reaction. Give them the rope." The formal petition came 2 weeks later. My uncle and my father, co-petitioners, were requesting that the probate court appoint a legal guardian to oversee the management of my grandfather's estate on the grounds that I was, in their words, displaying signs of instability inconsistent with sound fiduciary judgment. They submitted a statement from a psychiatrist I had never met. They submitted a declaration from the caretaker at the Lawrence Street property, which I later learned my uncle had pressured him into signing. They submitted the prescription bottle label, which they claimed a third party had found during a welfare check. Renata reviewed the filing and called me that evening. "They've spent money on this," she said, "which means they believe it will work, which means we need to give them something to believe in." That was the week I started wearing my grandfather's pen. He had given it to me 3 years before he died, a heavy gold-banded fountain pen from the 1950s that had belonged to his own father. I had kept it in a velvet box on my bookshelf, too precious to actually use. But Renata had a contact, a woman who worked in private security consulting, and that woman spent 48 hours carefully modifying the barrel of the pen without altering its exterior appearance in any way. The clip concealed a microphone sensitive enough to record a conversation from across a standard dining room. The cap contained a lens no larger than a shirt button. I wore it clipped to the outside of my portfolio every day for 3 weeks, and recorded nothing more interesting than contractor meetings and a very dull lunch with Diane. And then my mother called. She called on a Sunday, which she almost never did. Her voice had a texture to it that I recognized from childhood, the careful softness she deployed when she needed something from me that she knew I wouldn't want to give. She said that she and my father had been doing a lot of thinking. She said they were ashamed of how things had been handled. She said that my uncle had pushed them further into this situation than they were comfortable with, and that now that they had seen what he was truly capable of, they needed to make it right. She asked me to come to dinner. "Just the 4 of us," she said. "A real conversation. A chance to begin again." I sat with the phone pressed to my ear and looked at the framed photograph on my bookshelf, the one of me and my grandfather at a property opening in Savannah when I was 12. He was laughing at something I'd said. I was laughing too, my head tipped back, completely unguarded. "Okay," I said. "I'll come," my mother cried. She told me she loved me. She told me she would make pot roast, my grandfather's recipe, the one he had taught her when she was first married. She made it sound like homecoming. I hung up and sat very still for a moment. Then I called Renata. Traps only work when you don't know they're there. I walked into my parents' house that Friday evening knowing exactly where I was walking into, and I walked in anyway, because the alternative was arriving at that courtroom in 2 weeks with nothing but Renata's legal arguments and a very clean conscience. I needed them to show me what they had planned. I needed them to say it out loud. In a room with good acoustics and a pen on my portfolio, my uncle was there. Of course he was. He was in the living room when I arrived, a glass of wine already in his hand, and he greeted me with a warmth so convincing that if I hadn't spent the last 6 weeks watching him build a legal case against my mental competency, I might have believed it. My mother had set the dining room table with the good china. My father poured wine before we sat down, moving quickly, keeping his back to me longer than necessary. I noticed the smell before the glass reached my lips. Faint, almost decorative, like someone had added a drop of almond extract to a Bordeaux that didn't need it. I had done enough reading in the past 2 weeks to know what bitter almond meant in a beverage I hadn't poured myself. I set the glass down. I pressed my lips together and let my eyes go slightly unfocused. I let my hand rest heavily on the table, the way a hand rests when the muscles have gone a little soft. I blinked twice, slowly. My uncle watched me from across the table with the careful attention of a man waiting for a cue. I dropped my fork. It clattered against the plate with more force than necessary. I picked it up again slowly, clumsily. I let my speech thicken slightly when I answered a question about the weather. By the time the main course was cleared, they had stopped performing for me entirely. My uncle leaned forward with his elbows on the table and began talking to my father in a low, practical tone as though I were already somewhere else. He mentioned the notary. He mentioned the document package. He mentioned a physician who would be available first thing Monday to provide a supplementary evaluation, and he mentioned the language they would use in the updated petition, and he mentioned what my signature on the management transfer would mean for the timeline of the Lawrence Street sale. He mentioned the wire transfer. My mother refilled her own wine glass and looked at the chandelier. I sat there with my hands loose in my lap and the pen clipped to my portfolio on the table 3 feet away, and I listened to all of it. I listened to my uncle describe the plan to have me declared temporarily incompetent, sign over management authority, and liquidate the flagship asset of my grandfather's company before I could contest it. I listened to my father affirm each piece of it with the quiet, exhausted agreement of a man who stopped having his own opinions sometime in his 30s. I listened to my mother say nothing. And I thought, he forgot one thing. He forgot that my grandfather had built a company on the principle that every significant property has a condition. Every historic asset is protected by a covenant. Every document has language that most people skim and very few people read. The Lawrence Street property had a covenant attached to it that my grandfather had written himself and had notarized in 1994. Any attempt to initiate a forced transfer of that property without the written consent of the primary heir, under any circumstances, including legal guardianship, triggered an automatic reversion clause that returned full ownership to the Whitmore family trust, a trust of which I was the sole beneficiary. My uncle had spent 12 years working alongside my grandfather. He had reviewed the company's holdings dozens of times. He had, at some point in those 12 years, either read that covenant and forgotten it, or read it and assumed it would never be relevant to him. He had also spent 3 months building a legal case against me. Renata presented the recording in court on a Thursday morning. She didn't announce it. She didn't build to it. She simply stated that she had additional evidence to submit and pressed play on the audio from the dining room. My family's voices came through the courtroom speakers with uncomfortable clarity. My uncle's voice, measured and specific, laying out every component of the plan. My father's voice, agreeing. My mother's silence, which in that context said everything. My uncle rose halfway out of his chair and said it was fabricated. Renata submitted the authenticated metadata from the recording device. My uncle said the metadata could be altered. Renata pointed out that in his attempt to establish the legal case against me, my uncle had submitted to the court a property assessment report that he had commissioned without authorization, an assessment of the Lawrence Street property for purposes of sale. That assessment constituted an unauthorized action against a protected historic asset, which triggered the reversion clause, which had already been processed by the trust administrator 6 days prior. My uncle sat down. The judge looked at the paperwork for a long time. Then she looked at my uncle. Then she looked at my father. Then she looked at my mother. She asked one question. She asked my uncle if, at any point in his 12 years of professional involvement with Whitmore Restoration Group, he had read the covenant attached to the Lawrence Street property. He said yes. She nodded once, slowly, the way people nod when an answer confirms something they already suspected. The petition for guardianship was dismissed. The unauthorized assessment was entered into the record as evidence of bad faith. The question of the medication bottle, the staged office, the falsified declaration from the caretaker, All of it became part of a separate inquiry that I will leave to the legal process to sort out. My uncle left the courtroom between two people I had never seen before, and they were not friends. My father stopped at the door and turned around and looked at me for a moment. I don't know what he was looking for. I don't know if he found it. He turned back and walked out, and I haven't spoken to him since. My mother called me once, 3 weeks later, at 7 in the morning. I let it go to voicemail. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't known it would go that far, which was almost certainly true. She said she hoped I could understand that she'd been in an impossible position. I listened to the voicemail twice, and then I saved it. Because I am my grandfather's granddaughter, and he taught me that you keep everything in writing, and you never assume a conversation is finished. That was 8 months ago. The Lawrence Street property opened its doors last month as the flagship location of the Whitmore Preservation Fellowship, a program I spent 6 months building in partnership with 3 historic preservation nonprofits and a university architecture department. It provides residencies, funding, and workspace to women working in historic preservation and restoration, a field that has always been full of them and has always somehow managed to overlook them. We have 12 fellows in the first cohort. 3 of them are working on properties my grandfather identified for restoration before he died. I like to think he would have thought that was a good use of the space. I kept the architectural rendering, the one that was left face down on the carpet with the cracked glass. I had it reframed, the crack still visible through the glass, running diagonally across the lower right corner of the image. It hangs in the entryway of the building now, the first thing you see when you walk in. People ask me about the crack sometimes. I tell them it was already there when I found it. Which is true, technically. I just don't explain all the reasons I decided to keep it. My grandfather's pen is in the velvet box on my bookshelf again. I don't wear it anymore. I don't need to. But sometimes in the evenings I take it out and hold it for a minute. This heavy gold thing that his father carried through his entire adult life, that my grandfather carried through his, that I carried through one very specific and very necessary season of mine. There's a version of this story where I screamed in that staged office when I saw the medication bottle, where I called my uncle a liar in the middle of the courtroom and gave him exactly the performance he was counting on, where I walked into that dinner table and drank the wine and woke up somewhere I couldn't get out of easily. I've thought about that version of events more than I'd like to admit. But I kept thinking about what my grandfather said, about the people who love you loudest, about where their attention actually goes. Silence is the hardest thing to fake when you're terrified. It's also, it turns out, the only thing that can't be used against you. I walked into that courtroom carrying everything I needed. I walked out carrying everything I needed. I walked out carrying everything that was mine. Those two things are not always the same. I'm very lucky they were this time. And if you're in the middle of something like this right now, if someone in your life is building a story about you, using your name and your history and your own face as the raw material, I want you to hear this. The story they're building is not the only story available. You don't have to argue with it. You don't have to disprove it out loud, in real time, in front of people who have already decided what they want to believe. You just have to outlast it. Take notes. Keep records. Trust the person in your corner who has read the document everyone else skimmed. And when the moment comes, and it will come, don't say a word. Let the recording play.